afford to only charge this for rent, now they've got to charge this for rent, and then the folks that are there, pretty much, many of them have to move out and move on, and then you end up displacing the very people who you were literally buying in to potentially benefit from. So it's an interesting dynamic. So I don't inherently want you to minimize, that piece of it. I mean, it's not a huge, massive piece within this, but it's something to give some consideration to. Okay, thoughts on the arts thing? Anybody over here?
I definitely agree. I mean, like you said, it is an issue in terms of when you do implement something like that, like a artist live and work area, but over time, because it provides this presence of this artistic culture, you provide these coffee shops, other retail areas, it creates additional revenue and provides like this new focal point where people want to go.
It creates a sense of vibrancy to the community in one way or another.
But of course, like any other areas that increases in value, of course, it attracts it attracts new people who want to live there. Like if they're middle income or eventually high income earners, because they think it's a very attractive place to be.
But I guess the point that I'm just want to make sure that I'm clear, sort of on making is, you sort of, if you want to call it a life cycle, a neighborhood life cycle. You have kind of what we call the introduction sort of stage, and it obviously climbs up in value and population during that introduction stage, and then you sort of go into more of a maturity phase, maybe kind of sort of leveling out, and then in the next phase is potentially going to be well, is it going to decline, is it going to just stabilize, or is it potentially going to increase continually over time? And then this that sort of decision point there of so many communities, like with Woodwood, it's kind of gone through initially kind of the introduction, growth, maturity, and then it went into sort of a decline, and then now all of a sudden with all the art related stuff, well then it has kind of rebirthed into something else. But the interesting thing, as it rebirths, those values start to escalate, and once again, it gets to the point of the people that were able to afford to live there and afford to work there and afford to operate there. If it creeps back up to this point, those people are probably no longer going to be able to be there, and it's going to migrate into a totally different type of place where it's going to have to be super high-end artists and people with much higher incomes. Does that make sense? And then what may end up happening is, well, if there's not something really truly of substance there at that point, you could very well see it go back and decline again. Because if all the people that were making it cool and interesting and funky basically move out and move on, then what is there to keep the people that are there now or in the short-term future from continuing to stay there? And there may be some other element by virtue of it being relatively close to downtown that may keep it from spiraling back down, but at this point, who knows? Yep.
Couldn't, like, maybe the city or something like that, if the developer wanted to come in and do this, and I know not necessarily pertaining to this particular project, but in general, like for Wynwood or something, if a developer wanted to come in and keep the essence of the art there and everything like that, but they wanted to make it, awesome and whatnot, couldn't they like impose some sort of like development fee or impact fee saying we don't want to displace the artists that are helping make it what it is?
Yeah, no, I've seen communities where the city will actually mandate that there must be a certain number of quote unquote, units set aside, not just for low income people, but for artists. And so much so as to say that we're going to literally give them like a live work space. And I've seen some really cool ones where that it's sort of like in a commercial area, and they've been given an entire sort of storefront along a street, and in the front part is basically their art studio and gallery, and in the back part is where they live, but it's subsidized very heavily by, you know, the local government or by some sort of nonprofit or whatever, the arts community, to ensure that it stays like that for as long as they possibly can, and then it doesn't inherently get sold off. Because what they, in some cases, will do is this will be developed by a not-for-profit. And that's a whole other angle within that a lot of people don't really think about, is what is a nonprofit developer? It's not inherently what you might think it is, in the sense that you, as a nonprofit developer, you could build things like churches and schools and whatever else. Doesn't mean that you can't make money. It's just that it takes out some of yeah, in terms of, you can still cover all your costs, you still pay everybody a fair wage, but it's not, in one sense, kind of excessive. But it's interesting that you could theoretically come up with a mechanism to where you create a nonprofit solely for the purpose of developing artist housing. And then that way, into perpetuity, they're not going to be concerned about any sort of rate of return other than covering their cost of property taxes and insurance and whatever else, and then can allow those folks to, you know, exist or subsist in a way that hopefully benefits the community at large.
So in a way, they could like maybe negotiate, saying, hey, we set aside so much space or whatever, and we run it as a nonprofit or whatever. Like they could get some sort of, I don't know, discount or something, or tax.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just, once again, community by community, they can, you know, you can come up with potentially a scheme that would allow for something like that.
So, as a nonprofit, you would obviously have in your 1090 split, right? If it's a 501c3, you would have your salaries built into the 90. So you could still make 30% of whatever your project is as a salary.
You can still make money.
Still
it's just,
walk away.
But it's just a situation
Just
that
10% has to be recycled back in, where you could give some housing needs, correct?
Okay, all right. Other issues. What other issues are you guys facing with this project?
You have like demand for like how many housing units.
Okay, so how are you guys, both of you, dealing with the market demand side of things in terms of you know, coming up? I mean, obviously you're given some information within the text of this of coming up with market demand, but how are you looking at that information? How are you using that information, I guess, to determine what it is that you do?
Well, we, you know, they give you yearly numbers. We know this is a 3-year project, so we figure out our maximum density for each building, right? Like, what's the maximum amount? We obviously don't have enough room to put everything maxed out, but that gives us an idea to start kind of playing around with the chips and see how we, you know, segregate some office space, some affordable housing, and kind of do a good mix. I mean.
Okay. What about you guys? How are you using that market information that's provided to you?
I personally haven't looked at it yet because we kind of just got to the rolls
Okay.
last week.
All right. Fair enough.
So,
But I'm just giving what's dictated by what the city wants and what the market forecasts are. We just decide based upon that and what can be done, and have to compromise on that.
Okay.
I mean, you know, some of these buildings, right, like, you get higher density, but then you also have to allocate ground parking, so we're kind of looking at that too, like, yeah, it's got a high profit margin, but we're giving up, you know, I haven't done the percentages, but, you know, maybe 30%, you
Parking
gotta
could be
give up to
very
your
expensive.
parking.
Yeah, no, parking can be extremely expensive, and you know, that's one of the things that you know, the more urban and dense you know, a location is, especially when you get to start offering structured parking, those spaces are not cheap. You know, I mean, I think, you know, in a lot of parking garages, you know, you're looking at, you know, just a typical parking garage, you know, it may be anywhere between $15,000 to $30,000 or more a space. And, you know, versus just, you know, surface parking that may be only a couple $100 depending on you know, just putting down asphalt or whatever you're putting down. So, you know, that could be a very, and then if you obviously do underground parking, even more expensive. So, yeah, those are some very real issues that, you know, not only in this particular case you gotta deal with, but, you know, just from a practical standpoint. Now, that having been said, and I know that, you know, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about this, but we're just kind of curious what your perspective is. So the whole notion of the self-driving cars, obviously, I think we all agree that's becoming more and more of a reality. And so how's that gonna impact all these parking requirements for, you know, these very dense locations? I mean, are we really gonna,
I think you can minimize the parking requirement, because they're saying you'll be able to send your car home.
yeah, or somewhere, you know, a few blocks away or whatever it might be out of
I
the,
don't believe it, but Stu.
I mean, I can tell you, I have a friend who's already, she's in DC, and they're working on who to sue. She's an attorney, they're working on who gets sued when one of these,
right.
so they're working on the different,
But, you know, I mean, it's already having, I mean, you know, clearly, not just the self-driving cars, but, you know, the services like Uber and Lyft, you know, in Miami, they're, you know, a lot of the parking garages are suffering, with regard to, because their usage is way down. The, folks, the valet companies that are valet parking, their revenues are way down, you know, just from people using Uber and Lyft. So, you know, one has to begin to I mean, say, well, it's a real phenomenon, you know, just even with the ride-sharing aspect as to, you know, what that's really gonna translate into, you know, in the future for a lot of these structured parking facilities. Are we really gonna need that many of them, you know, versus, you know, being able to, you know, send the cars elsewhere, or do we start, you know, once again, more car sharing, you know, things as well? You get rid of the driver and get rid of even the ownership of the car, and you just, basically the car just constantly is going from one person to another, and you know, not really ever having to park.
And then when you do park, it's probably gonna be expensive.
Well, not if you've got all these empty spaces that people no longer need.
Well, I'm saying for the people who don't wanna do an Uber or don't wanna do a Lyft, and they like to drive their nice car to wherever, you know, you have those
I
people.
I mean,
that
slow
are-
I actually enjoy driving, but I think about, you know, would it be cheaper for me to, not me personally wouldn't be, but for the average person to just Uber everywhere,
Right.
rather than pay their insurance, their car insurance, pay their monthly
Oh,
payment,
absolutely.
you know, repairs.
It's like a car payment.
Right. But-
Gas.
And I didn't want to get too far off on the tangent with this, but I think it is important, you know, that just from the standpoint of, you know, these are the kinds of things that you should really begin to think about, not necessarily for an urban plan, but certainly, you know, in the real world context of some of these emerging technologies and what their impacts are gonna be, because I would think, you know, it's got to be very significant. It's one of those things that's probably gonna happen very quickly when it does.
With the boat show in town, I actually was having this thought, it's like, well, when do boats become obsolete because you have planes, when, you know, when do they, but they won't, and I realize that. The thought crossed my mind, it's like, huh, it takes me X amount of days to get from here to here on a yacht, or I could take a jet. But it's not the same, so they won't become obsolete, and I think cars will never become obsolete
No.
because there's something inherent in.
No, I don't disagree.
People love their cars.
But the whole point is the same sort of argument that I think you can make with online shopping versus physical bricks and sticks retail, that there probably will always be some demand for the bricks and sticks retail, but it's not going to ever be what it once was because of the online shopping, and that, you know, that makes, you know, a huge dent in, you know, whether or not we need to allocate as much space in an urban environment for retail, you know, shops.
Which is kinda interesting, cause all these malls are expanding, so.
Yeah, which seems very counterintuitive.
Counterintuitive, right? You've got Aventuras planning agent expansion, Bar Harbor, Dadeland, Galleria, it's like everybody's putting money in
Yeah.
when everything's telling you not to.
I don't disagree. Okay, all right, so what other issues? And I'm gonna let you guys work on this on your own.
I think we were trying to decide like the placement,
Okay.
the kind of flow that we wanna have here. If we were gonna kind of keep it.
Lower density versus higher density versus high traffic versus low traffic, that sort of thing?
Well, yeah, that too, but you know, office and maybe
Gotcha.
keep the residential over here where it seems to be
Predominant.
exactly, and there's more transit over here.
Yep.
So we were thinking, I think last, that we were gonna kinda do block by block. And maybe come up with some ideas, each of us, and see how we felt about that.
Okay, all right, what about you guys over here?
You kind of laid it out, we're, for the most part, demand and transit oriented. You know, and with preserving what's existing.
All right,
We haven't thought anything past that in terms of that.
okay,
It's
all right.
our job.
Okay, I'm gonna shut up now and let you guys try to work through some of this.
So one thing with the site plan is that we have to consider the residency and how the three of the buildings surrounding it, so everything looks uniform. So do we know exactly the height of these buildings, or like the structures, what they look like in comparison to what we're putting here? I don't know, just one last one, do you know?
I don't know.
The northern really isn't much of,
Kind of right up on.
there's not really
We did put a little.
We did.
space in
Oh,
ours, remember?
I can come up with that idea.
We did have a little.
Yeah, I remember by the affordable housing or some,
Yeah, like, see, look.
but it's fine. But,
And then just saw this too, the public open space and recreation
but I think that,
facilities. They get 50% city contribution.
Made by the church or by the
So
YMCA.
yeah,
So you do that,
definitely
we change it to a park.
be solidified as the
That would
state
be
park.
nice, yeah.
But then, how did
Because there's only so much
You also
land,
consider
and
it
it's
sidewalk
where that's sort of, the
because-
YMCA was just redone and that's not on our park.
So are you suggesting then moving the skate
Oh,
park?
it'd be-